everyone, I'm Miss Twisted. This video is just gonna be like a record of like the last month of my life, creating the most elaborate, insane cosplay I have ever made in the shortest amount of time I've ever made a cosplay. So you guys might have already seen the trailers for the game Forspoken, which has just dropped from Square Enix. This is actually sponsored by Square Enix.
Let's do this.
I'm so excited for this. Long story short, they asked me to create one of their characters as a cosplay. I did have my options available and I had to choose Tanta Sila. Like, look at this design. It is incredible. There's so much elaborate little pieces involved. Everything about her character is just like this strong sort of feminine, I don't know, I like it, whatever it is. Might be crushing her a tiny bit. So this video is basically going to be not quite a tutorial, kind of a cross between a tutorial and a montage of just like the last month of my life and all the chaotic energy that was involved. I hope you guys like it. I think it's a really interesting design, so I'm so excited that I got to bring this one to life. Let's get into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is just break all of this down into like several little bite-sized chunks. So you've got the helmet, the dress base, the collar and shoulders thing going on, all those bits on the torso, this elaborate belt sort of design down the middle there. You have to paint all of this in that beautiful sort of like silvery gold color, beautiful big cape and the sleeves, that tulle overskirt with all that embroidery and the flowers, and then you've got to put it all together. So I've decided I'm going to start off with the helmet for this one because it looks like my favorite part already. EVA foam seemed like the best choice for the helmet, so I'm going to use an existing pattern that I have, tracing the pieces out onto my foam, cutting them out with a hobby knife, and I'm going to blast them a bit with a heat gun and just sort of curve them in the place that I want. That way when I apply the contact adhesive and glue them all together, I don't have to like sort of work it and pull it into shape quite as much. This turned out fantastic. Doesn't fit on my head though, so I had to make another one using some slightly thinner foam, which turned out much better. Now once I've cut off the excess of this helmet, this is looking like a great shape for me. I'm going to cut out a massive big disc out of that same foam and just glue it straight onto the top of the helmet. To fill out some of these seams that I've got going on right now, I'm using some foam clay, which I'm just going to use with some wet hands to sort of rub it into those gaps. That way I can make it as smooth as possible. I am still going to need to sand this, but hopefully this means a little bit less sanding overall because I hate sanding, it's the worst. For all those triangles on the front of the helmet, I did try cutting these out individually and gluing them on. I hated how this looked, guys, so I ended up ripping them all off instead. What I ended up doing instead was using a flat piece of EVA foam. I did a little tester here where I've essentially like used a heat gun to curve it around this glass sphere and then scoring the triangle lines into it, running it again over the heat gun to open up those cuts a little bit more. This seems to be working great, so let's try it on a bigger piece that I'm going to glue onto the helmet. This is working fantastic on the bigger piece. In order to keep that rounded shape as I'm gluing it on, I'm gluing it from the center and heat gunning it and curving it and stretching it into place as I glue it on all around the helmet here. Now that this is all in place, I'm just going to use a little marker to sort of mark out where I want to cut off the excess triangles, roughly to the same shape that it appears in the concept art. Once these are all cut out, it's time to score it all. So I'm going to score through each of these lines and then just run over it with a heat gun. And I'm really happy with how this is looking. I removed some of those like inner triangle cutouts that she seems to have on her headpiece as well. With this all done, I wanted to apply some of those ridges around the big disc. I had for this one some strips of EVA foam, which has been pre-cut into like a triangular shape. I just called it pointy spaghetti. Just sort of laid up those rings here. Once those are done, I'm going to cut out one more big piece, which I'm going to put over the top as the last bit of the big disc. Alright, putting all this on, I'm really happy with how this is looking, guys. Now we've got to do all those little dangly bits. So these little S doobie wackies that she's got like a bazillion of around here, these were so much fun to make, guys, and I think it's probably like one of my favorite parts of the costume if I do say so myself. So it took a lot of trial and error to try and work out exactly how to do these little S shapes. In the end, I got some craft foam, cut it out into those S shapes. I'm cutting a little tiny strip of that same foam to glue down the center of it. Essentially what I'm going to do with this is heat some warbler over the top of it and just let it sink into those gaps, and that little strip down the middle will help hold up some of that warbler in this center area to sort of create a fair bit of depth to this shape. Once I've got these two shapes, I'm going to cut off that excess warbler, heating them up again to sort of sandwich the two bits together to create one full S shape. And then I'm going to do it another 10 or so times to create all of these different shapes here. You can see I've also used a bit of that scrap warbler and like rolled it out into a sausage shape, curved it round to sort of create like a slightly open link. I'm going to use these to sort of link some of these pieces together in a moment. Once I've got all of these, I'm going to glue some of the flat pieces onto the helmet here. And to create the pieces that sort of hang down, again, I'm going to use some more scraps of Warbler to join some of them together like little links, including a bit of glue where I need to create some hooks that are going to actually hang from the helmet where they're going to attach to, just using those tiny little scraps of Warbler. I'm going to glue some of them just under the pointy spaghetti that I've got here, just to hide them a little bit. This seemed to work out pretty well, and with these little like slightly open little hooks that I've got, I can slip them on quite easily and they dangle and move around nicely. Apart from the fact that you can just hear clacking all the time you wear this is looking great. I'm happy with this. So the dress part wasn't really too hard at all. The hard part was just finding the fabric that I like, so I did a lot of shopping for this. I ended up finding this amazing fabric, which is a cotton and silk blend, which means it's got this lovely bit of shine to it, but not that sort of like tacky, plasticky shine that some of the cheap satin has. It also has like a lovely drapey texture to it, and it's not as expensive as you'd think, which was always a bonus when you have to use a ton of it. The pattern I'm using for a dress is like a very simple formal pattern. You don't really need anything super fancy because of course most of Tanta Sila's dress is covered in all those intricate gold pieces. I am using some interfacing for one of the first times ever because I want to make sure the bodice is relatively strong and holds its shape well, especially considering how many bits and pieces are going to be attached around the torso. This one's an iron-on one, of course, as you can see, and I am using a bit of poplin over the top of here because I know that silks sometimes are not great with an iron. This is giving my fabric some great structure, so once I get this all pinned in place using these wonder clips rather than actual pins, I don't know why I said pins, I'm just going to sew all of these into place and chuck it straight on the mannequin. I'm not going to dwell too much into the sewing, guys, because truth be told, I don't really know what I'm doing when it comes to sewing, but now I can move on to all of those little gold bits. I'm really keen to get started on all of these shoulder and collar pieces. And when I say keen, I mean I was dreading it. This was absolutely insanely complex. If you have a look at like the concept art and the in-game files, you have all of this filigree around the shoulders. You have this insane like sort of, I don't even know the words to describe it, around the collar here. And then you've got like this rope like interlaced through it as well. And you've got like two different sections of fabric in the collar itself. This was definitely going to be the part that took me the longest, and I struggled to figure out where to start from this one. But I decided to just go like from the inside, work outwards, see how things go, you know? And it worked out alright. Let's get into it. I'm breaking out my trusty craft foam again to cut out the shapes of the collar and just create a bunch of these little tiny 3D shapes, including these little crescent moon shapes, which kind of turned out more like lemon wedges, but once you had the Warbler over the top of it, it worked out beautifully. So again, I'm doing that same shrink wrappy technique with the Warbler. I'm sure there's a better name for it, but I'm calling it shrink wrapping because it sounds cool. So once this was all covered with Warbler, I'm working it in with my hands and occasionally some silicone tools just to line each of the edges, make sure everything's looking nice and crisp. I was really happy with how this is turning out, so I'm just gonna cut out roughly the shape of the shoulders that I want, and then I'm gonna jump straight into using this sort of side collar sections. These took a bit of trial and error again, but in the end I just found a pattern that I really liked with the craft foam, and then I'm just gonna sandwich it between two pieces of Warbler, cutting that out so that I've got like some nice smooth pieces. Once I've got them together, I'm just gonna sort of slowly work them into the slightly 3D shape you see here. So it was pretty straightforward. Now onto the shoulders, I decided to cut these bits out of craft foam once more, and I had to sort of draw on a rough idea of the design for this one because these are, once again, insanely detailed. For this bit, I really sort of played it by ear because it's really hard to get an angle of all of the filigree details from like the trailers and concept art that we have so far, but I'm pretty happy with overall how it looked. So it was just a case of using some EVA foam to build up those shapes and gluing on like strips of craft foam, and in the end I loved using some foam clay to create these more rounded shapes with the filigree. Quick PSA guys, don't start getting stuck into crafting while you're trying to roast some zucchini. Alright, back to my favorite little shrink wrapping method for the Warbler. I am putting it over a cardboard tube for this bit, just so it's still already curved by the time I put it on my shoulders. I don't have to like also curve it and lose a lot of those details that I've already spent so long carving out in the Warbler here. For the inner collar sections, I've just got some more of my craft foam. I really should have bought this in bulk, guys, and gluing it onto some grey suede because the underside of this suede is this lovely charcoal color, so it's perfect. I've just got a tiny bit of silver paint on these details on the top. The frill is going to be nice and easy because I actually managed to find some existing rather than be having to pre-make all of this white frill curly stuff, so it's just a case of gluing them both in around the rim of the collar here. The whole torso section is certainly the most triangle-y of all of the cosplay that I've got. You've got those side boobs, massive necklace-y thing hanging down in the middle, and then of course you've got those ribs at the side, sort of seashell shape. Sorry, my chicken is screaming about the fact that she just laid an egg, so nice job. Very distracting. For these side sections, I'm going to use that same technique that I used for the helmet triangles, which is just going to be using some craft foam instead of some EVA foam, scoring it, curving it with the heat gun until I'm happy with the shape. I was a little bit worried with this one that it wouldn't hold the shape once I start pulling it on and off the mannequin, so I ended up getting like a red bra, cutting out that cup section, and then gluing it onto the back of these triangles, just so it'll hopefully keep holding that curvy shape. This is just ready for painting now, so I'm going to put this aside. Moving on to the sort of necklacey thing. It's more triangles, guys. So I'm just going to cut out a bunch of these little triangles and sandwich them between two pieces of Warbler, as I've done with some of the other pieces so far. I used a hole punch to create some little holes where I'm going to put the links through, but these sort of warped a little bit, so I'm just going to reheat them, press them into the table to sort of just reinforce that edge, make sure it's nice and straight. Now I'm just going to use a bunch of little tiny pieces of Warbler as sort of links and just link all of these triangles together. Once I've done that, guess what's on the top? It's more triangles. I've just got some more of these pieces that I'm going to put some Warbler around and then just glue the whole thing into place. Luckily, Warbler does stick to itself once it's heated, so it was a combination of glue and Warbler to stick these all on. I put a chain in the back here, as you can see, basically just using that same method that I used to put the hooks onto the little S shapes on the helmet. For the last bit, it's these weird sort of rib shapes. Again, I'm just sandwiching some foam between these. I sort of played around a little bit with these. They're harder than they look because you have to sort of curve the Warbler itself rather than just having like a nice flat shape that curves around. It sort of like curves in both directions, if that makes any sense. These little scallop shapes right on the end were also a little bit hard, but it just took a little bit of manipulation to sort of curve the Warbler in the shape that I want. And then once these are all cooled down, I'm happy with how they're looking. We'll see how they look when they're painted up. For the belt, I wasn't 100% sure how I wanted to do because it looks slightly different in the concept art to how it looks in the game from what we've seen so far. But in game, it has these sort of interlocking chunks of gold. The less gem and glass elements to this one looks better because she's got that whole like metal and silk thing going on, which I think is like a really cool juxtaposition. Oh, I'm rambling. The point is, I used the game version of it from what we could see, and it turned out pretty good. So I'm going to create a base bit of fabric, just measuring it up against the dress here and cutting it out of some just plain red suiting fabric. Nice and strong, no shine to it. Just going to be a base that everything else gets stuck to. Now, the little belt buckle section right at the top, there wasn't really any clear screenshots or like images that I could find that shows this in great detail. So I did sort of have to use a little bit of creative license here. I think it still sort of like keeps the essence of the overall look. In fact, it turned out to be some of my best work in terms of like smooth shapes. There's some cool little trinkety pieces at the top and bottom of this middle belt section as well. So again, I'm just using some craft foam and some EVA foam to build up those shapes. For the little mosaic pieces either side, I had all of this spare offcuts of EVA foam, so I just cut out a bunch of different size rectangles out of that and then just laid them out, made sure I had enough, and then cut some more just in case. This little strip of red craft foam that I used, I'm going to use as a base where all of those sort of mosaic tiles are coming down, and I've got some chain either side. Now for those little mosaic pieces, I wasn't quite sure what to use and I struggled to find something that suited until I checked a local $2 shop and they had these amazing gaudy little rhinestones. But once I went over them with a Sharpie, both a little bit in black and a little bit in blue to create some variation, once I stuck these all down, it muted a little bit and made it look actually pretty great. I'm going to assemble it later on. It's time to move on to some painting. Most of this video is a little bit out of order. A lot of the time I'd be like waiting on this glue to dry, so moving over to this section, coming back to this bit once that's dry, putting on a little layer over here. I'm trying to sort of squeeze it into like more categories for you guys and for me to get my head around it as well. But just keep that in mind. Here's how the priming and painting went. Now, usually I would use something like Flex Bond for the painting, which basically is a primer that's going to allow a lot of flexibility, but everywhere was sold out. And I don't know if you guys are familiar, but in Australia, it's really hard to get things in from overseas without it taking a million years. So instead, I'm going to use several layers of watered down Mod Podge for this. It should still have the same effect, just probably won't flex quite as much, so I hopefully don't really need anything here to be super flexible. But once it's all had several coats of that, everything's getting a priming layer of spray paint, which is going to take it to like a nice flat grayish white for everything. Then everything's getting a layer of silver spray paint and a layer of gold spray paint. So it's just all a nice flat color. I'm using silver and then gold so that essentially it creates sort of this champagne-y gold color and it's not too much of a yellow gold. Once I've done this, the only details I'm going to put in at this stage is going back over the helmet with a flat black acrylic that's quite thinned out, just so I can get into all those little crevices of the triangles and around the pointy spaghetti areas of that disc, just because I want that to be really, really essentially textured. I'm going to go back over everything at some point, but I wanted to get those bits done. So when I went back to the fabric shop, they had run out of my silk cotton blend that I used for the dress, so I ended up making the cape out of pure silk. I spent way too much money on this. Having said that, like, I really wanted the cape to be perfect. You see a lot of it with Tanta Sila, like she's flicking her arms around. I wanted it to be shiny on both sides. I wanted the cape to really be perfect. So I have no regrets, but oh my god, I spent so much money on the cape. The pattern for the cape was super simple. I've just got two long rectangles of the silk and then just doubling them up so it's shiny on both sides. I'm cutting out an arch out of the top of each one so that it essentially like hangs between my wrist and my elbow. Because I've kept these arches quite loose, I am getting some invisible bra straps which I've sewn into a band and then sewn onto that section, so that essentially helps grip onto my arm while I'm swishing around my arms looking dramatic as Tanta Sila. It's not going to slip around too much. Now for the sleeves, they're going to be a little bit more complex. To start with, I'm just going to make this plain little trapezium, this shape here, and just sew some Velcro onto each side of that so it covers through my whole forearm here. Now Tanta Sila has this sort of gold cuff on one side. It seems to be pretty simple to the one Frey's wearing, so I'm wondering if there's a connection there. But in any case, I've got a big long strip of EVA foam dowel, which I'm just going to wrap around this piece here and just blast it with a heat gun to essentially get it to stay in that shape. Now taking this off once it's cooled down, you can see these coils are staying beautifully. So I'm going to glue this piece straight onto that poplin, and then I'm going to cut it down roughly where that Velcro sits, so it's easy for me to get that cuff on and off. I'm also scoring some crisscrosses onto the top of it just to sort of create a little tiny bit of subtle texture once it's painted up. I want to take a second to gush about Tanta Sila's like visual design, because I am absolutely in love with the fact that she's got this amazing juxtaposition between like beautiful frills and flowers and feminine curves and filigree, and then like these really hard elements like the triangular geometry shape, big overbearing helmet. The design is just so good. Let's get back to it, but I want to talk about that for a second. So anyway, the sleeves that Tanta Sila has have all these beautiful, glorious ruffles. So I'm going to create a ton of these in some slightly different fabrics. Some of them are offcuts from the dress and the cape that I've made so far, and a couple from my own fabric stash too. I'm going to cut a rectangle shape out of each of these and iron them so that they're nice and clean and flat. I'm going to use my sewing machine here to manually ruffle these up, just sort of pushing it through a little bit at a time to gather it. That way it's creating these nice neat ruffles when it comes out. I'm going to layer up these ruffles and sew each one on gradually to the base here. And trying them on, I'm pretty happy with how this is looking. The one on the gold cuff side will attach later on, but the other side that she has kind of got this sort of velvet finish to it. So I do have a little bit of this red velvet that I'm going to sew directly over the top of this base. And for all these little gold and black button details, you might have noticed before I had some white buttons when I was painting them, which I've then put all the priming and the gold paint over the top of. I'm going to glue each of these down with some E6000, some nice strong super glue, and some of the bigger buttons I'm going to put stitches through as well. For the black section in the middle, again, I've got some fantastic little gems from the $2 shop. I'm going to spray these with a black after some priming, and once they're fully dry, they're just going to get glued straight over the top, and I am 100% happy with how this is looking. So apparently I'm a bit of a masochist because I made the skirt way more complex than it needed to be. In the concept art game for Tanta Sila, it looks like all of that lace trim and embroidery art and flowers is like straight onto the dress base, which works great in the game, but I think in real life that might make it seem a little bit flat. So instead I decided to basically do a overskirt of like a bridal tulle, which is this stuff that I can basically put all of the embroidery and flowers and trim onto. It's also partly because I'm not very experienced with anything to do with embroidery, so I had a feeling that if I didn't do something like this, I was going to destroy the base dress by just mucking it up. But it worked out pretty well in the end. I think it did give it a lot of depth.
So I've got a semicircle of this tulle, and I've got this fantastic lace tulle as well, which I'm going to use the bottom of because it's this perfect trim for the lace trim at the bottom of Tanta Sila's dress. I'm going to cut that trim straight off the rest of the fabric here, cutting as close as I can to the actual design. Now the tough part about this is I'm using basically a big long straight piece of fabric and trying to sew it onto the bottom of a circular shape. So I'm going to have to pin this all in place very, very carefully, and occasionally just with my fingers as I'm sewing, work it into the right shape so that it's sort of curving with the bottom of the fabric. Once I had this all done and laid the tulle skirt up against the mannequin, I was really happy with how everything was sitting. Let's go on to the embroidery and see what the heck we can do about this.
So I was speaking to someone at the fabric shop about being nervous about like how to figure out embroidery, and I discovered this stuff, or more to the point, they recommended this stuff. This is stabilizer, and this is water soluble stabilizer, so it's like really thick cling film, but it's nice and strong, so you can essentially like lay it down between bits of fabric as you're sewing, and it kind of just holds everything stable. And this literally dissolves away in water. It's actually so fun. I had a great time. I think it seems to be used quite a bit in embroidery, so I highly recommend it. Listen to me talking about it like I know what I'm doing. Go to your fabric store, check it out. It's good fun. Not cheap though.
So some cosplayers use puff paint against the fabric in the design that they want and then go back over that with a zigzag stitch to sort of create the illusion of really fine embroidery work. I'm going to try something similar by cutting out my design out of a felt and then sewing that onto the tulle and going back over it with that zigzag stitch. Even with the stabilizer, it was puckering the tulle quite a bit as I was doing the zigzag stitching, so I decided that on the main thing, I'm going to do each of these pieces individually on some scrap tulle that I have and then cut them off that tulle, then use a straight stitch to sew it onto the actual half circle skirt that I have. It seems a bit more of a roundabout way of doing things, but I'm just making it idiot proof so I can get by my own lack of knowledge in this area. So each of these pieces were going over with a zigzag stitch. I melted off all of that stabilizer, cut it off the scrap pieces of tulle, laid all of it out to dry so that it's sitting nice and flat, and then each of these were essentially like sewn onto this tulle layer using a nice straight stitch. This turned out pretty decent. I don't think anyone is really going to spot any massive issues with this unless they're looking at it like a couple of centimeters away.
So for all of those flowers, I genuinely thought I would have to end up like cutting out strips of foam or fabric for each of the individual petals and like curving it to shape and things like that, till I found these poinsettias. Hang on. Poinsettia. Red flowers. So my local $2 shop was still selling these as it was just after Christmas, which are kind of like the right shape petals roughly for what I'm after, so I decided to buy a ton of these instead.
So I ended up harvesting all the petals off of these red flowers and cutting them into the shapes that I want. Tanta Sila's flowers seem to all follow the same triangle motif where there's like 3 big petals and 3 small petals into each of these. To put together the flowers, I'm just putting a bit of hot glue onto some poplin and then just like letting the petals sit into each of these until they sort of cool down into the shape that I want. Hot glue works best for this because it's sort of drying in that sort of 3D shape to hold that shape of that flower rather than letting it sink into like a flat shape. I made about 50 of these, so that's around 300 or so petals. It took a while, guys. I've got these beautiful little red glass beads and I'm just going to put a few of them in the middle of each of these flowers, just using some E6000 super glue just to create a little bit of something interesting in the middle so it's not just hot glue that you see. I wanted to finish off this belt piece before I did anything else so I can lay it down so the flowers aren't going to get in the way. So essentially it's just a case of gluing this strip of blue mosaic tiles down the middle and then laying out all of those little gold pieces around the outside, gluing them down as I went, making sure I'm happy with the shape. Once these and all of the flowers are laid out on the tulle skirt, I'm going to use a tiny bit of a felt square and essentially like lift it up the tulle skirt, put the felt square with the glue facing towards the tulle. That way the glue is going to kind of come through the netting of the tulle a little bit, and that way when I stick the flower down on the other side, that glue is literally anchoring itself through the tulle. Some of the larger flowers I did also stitch on a little bit on the underside, but I thought the glue was going to make it nice and easy for it to get in place without having to lift the skirt up as I'm working.
So at this stage, everything's been made. Most things have been painted. It's all just in like these little pieces. So the most satisfying part is being able to put it all together at the end and just seeing how good everything looks together.
So all of my gold bits are looking pretty flat, so I'm going to go in with a sort of sandy brown and just like work work this paint into essentially the crevices of the triangles and the crevices of the filigree, just to create a bit of depth everywhere. On the collar, I decided to glue on this rope rather than tying it around, just so it's always going to stay in place no matter how much I wear this thing. With all the yellow gold and the brown paint that I've put on, some of it was looking a little bit too warm in color, so I did go back in with some watered down silver paint, feathering little strokes, brush it into some of those areas, just trying to hit the tops of everything, just to try and keep it back into that slightly cooler gold color. Once those last bits of painting is done, I'm just going to sew that tulle skirt together and sew that onto the dress base itself, and then it's time to start sewing on all of those little details. Most of this I could actually sew on, some of it I actually used invisible thread for, and yes, some of it was literally stabbing the needle right through the warbler to get this sewn on. Some of the spare gold buttons I put around the hips here and added in again some of those like little black gems on top. The last few things needed gluing together, like the ruffle onto the gold cuff and the cape onto the back of the shoulder pieces, and a few last minute bits of paint touch-ups just where some of the gold had flaked off from too much movement, and then suddenly it was all over and it was 100% finished. I just felt pure joy once I was able to put all of this on, and exhaustion. There was a lot of exhaustion.
So I've organized a photo shoot to do for this cosplay because I don't think that my own skills and photography equipment could truly capture the majesty of this design. I really want to do justice to the amazing Tanta Sila. I am so honored to be able to have created this. Doing a photo shoot in cosplay outside of like a convention is a little bit daunting because everyone is staring at you, which was very interesting. But the good news is, with the mask covering like most of my face, I felt a little bit less self-conscious than usual. So I think this is just going to be like my power outfit from now on. Once again, thank you so much to Square Enix for this opportunity. I can't believe I got the chance to do this. I am so excited to play this game. I want to see Tanta Sila in person. Well, you know, figuratively speaking. And I really can't wait to like just jump around as Frey. The sort of parkour element and just like that joyous movement they've got going on is going to be so exciting to try out. I hope you guys liked this video. Please like, subscribe, share with your friends. It would mean an awful lot to me. Please go check out the game Forspoken. I'm so excited for it. I hope you enjoy it. I'll catch you guys later. Bye!